The message you thought would never come has already reached them, chosen one. And what they learned about your silence has completely changed the way they remember you. Someone finally told your soulmate what you were hiding behind all those quiet moments, and now they are sitting with a truth they cannot easily escape. They thought you were distant because you stopped caring. They thought you walked away because your feelings had faded. They may have even convinced themselves that your silence was a punishment, an attitude, or proof that you had already moved on. But now they know you were holding back because there was too much inside you to explain without breaking down. There were words you typed and deleted, conversations you wanted to have but never started, and moments when you desperately wanted them to ask what was wrong. Instead, you stayed quiet. You smiled when you were hurting. You said you were fine when you were anything but fine. And someone who knew the truth has finally opened that door for them. Imagine your soulmate looking at an old memory they once dismissed, only to realize they were standing beside a completely different story. That moment when you suddenly became quiet, it meant something. That distance, it meant something. The way you stopped fighting for an explanation, that meant something too. And now they are connecting the pieces. They are realizing that your silence wasn't emptiness, it was protection. You were protecting your heart, protecting the connection, perhaps even protecting them from knowing how deeply they had affected you. That's why the regret feels different now. They aren't simply missing you. They are questioning everything they thought they understood about you. And the most painful part is that the truth someone revealed isn't even the deepest secret you carried. Because there is one thing you never told your soulmate about why you finally chose silence. And when they discover that part, they are going to understand exactly what they lost. Someone finally gave your soulmate the piece of the story you never had the courage to explain. And now they are going back through every memory with completely different eyes. The truth they heard wasn't simply that you cared. It was that you were carrying far more emotion than you ever allowed them to see. You were fighting battles inside yourself while making sure they never had to carry the weight of them. That is what makes this realization so painful for them. They thought your silence was a decision against them, when in reality, your silence was often a decision to protect yourself from saying something you might regret. There were moments when you wanted to tell them everything. You wanted to say how deeply their actions affected you, how much their presence mattered, how certain words stayed in your mind long after the conversation ended. But every time you came close to revealing the truth, something inside you pulled back. Maybe you were afraid they wouldn't understand. Maybe you had already seen enough signs to know that vulnerability could leave you exposed. Or maybe you simply couldn't bring yourself to place your heart in someone's hands when you weren't sure they knew how to hold it. So you became quiet, and they misunderstood that quietness completely. Someone may have finally told them you don't understand what they were going through when they stopped talking to you. And that sentence alone could have changed everything. Because now your soulmate is remembering the moments they thought you were being cold. They are remembering the messages where your answers became shorter. They are remembering the time you looked like you wanted to say something, but suddenly changed the subject. They are remembering the goodbye that seemed strangely calm. At the time, they didn't know what was happening behind your eyes. Now they are beginning to understand that you were not running out of feelings. You were running out of strength. Imagine someone standing outside a house for years, believing there was nothing inside because the windows were dark, only to discover that the entire time someone had been awake behind the curtains. That's what your silence is becoming to them now, a hidden world they never knew existed. They are realizing that while they were waiting for you to explain yourself, you were waiting for them to notice without being asked. And perhaps that is the part that hurts the most. You didn't always need a grand gesture. You needed understanding. You needed them to notice the change in your voice, the hesitation behind your words, the way you became quieter after certain conversations. You wanted them to ask, "Are you really okay?" and stay long enough to hear the answer. But when that never happened, you learned how to carry your emotions alone. This is why your soulmate's regret is beginning to deepen. They are realizing that some of the moments they considered insignificant were actually moments when you were silently deciding whether it was safe to remain emotionally open. They may now be thinking about the things they said without realizing how deeply those words landed. They may remember times when they were distracted while you were desperately trying to communicate without actually saying the words. And suddenly those memories don't feel ordinary anymore. They feel like missed opportunities, like doors they walked past without realizing someone was standing behind them, waiting for them to knock. You might be wondering, if they finally know the truth, why didn't they know it before? Because people often understand the value of something only after the emotional noise becomes quiet enough for them to hear what was always underneath it. When they were close to you, they may have been focused on what you were doing instead of why you were doing it. They saw the silence, but not the pain behind it. They saw the distance, but not the disappointment that created it. They saw you walking away, but never stopped to ask what had pushed you to that point. Now someone else has filled in those missing pieces, and your soulmate is being forced to confront a possibility they never wanted to consider. Maybe they judged you too quickly. Maybe they misunderstood your intentions. Maybe the person they thought had stopped caring was actually the person who cared enough to leave without making them feel guilty. And that realization can be devastating, because there is another truth beginning to emerge. You didn't hide your feelings because they were small. You hid them because they were enormous. You knew that if you finally said everything, there would be no way to take those words back. So you protected them. You protected yourself. You allowed silence to speak for you when your heart could no longer risk another misunderstanding. And now your soulmate is hearing the story from someone who saw what you never showed them. They are learning that behind your calm was emotion, behind your distance was attachment, and behind your silence was a heart that had been trying desperately not to break. But this is only the beginning of what they are realizing. Because the person who told them the truth didn't just explain why you became silent. They revealed something about the sacrifices you made for this connection, something your soulmate never even knew you were giving up. And once they understand what you quietly sacrificed without asking for recognition, their regret is going to become much harder to ignore. And this is where the truth begins to hurt them in a completely different way, because your soulmate is no longer simply remembering what happened between you. They are finally understanding what their actions may have cost them. The person who told them the truth didn't just explain your silence. They gave your soulmate a perspective they never had before, and suddenly those old moments are becoming impossible to look at the same way. The conversation where you became unusually quiet, the message you never sent the moment you stopped asking questions, the time you walked away without demanding an explanation, all of it is being replayed inside their mind. They may be asking themselves, how did I not see this? Because the hardest part of regret is not missing someone. It is realizing that you misunderstood someone while you still had the chance to understand them. They thought you were becoming distant because you no longer wanted the connection. Now they are wondering if you became distant because you were hurting too much to keep proving that you cared. They thought you were protecting your pride. Now they are realizing you may have been protecting your heart. And those are two completely different stories. Imagine finding an old photograph and suddenly discovering that one person in the picture was holding back tears while everyone else was smiling. The photograph hasn't changed. The moment hasn't changed. But your understanding of it has completely changed. That is what is happening inside your soulmate right now. Every memory is still the same, but the meaning behind those memories has shifted. The silence they once interpreted as rejection now feels like restraint. The distance they thought meant indifference now looks like self-protection. Even the moments when you seemed completely calm may now feel suspicious to them, because they are beginning to understand how much emotion you were hiding underneath that calm exterior. And there is something especially painful about realizing that someone you loved was hurting quietly while you were convinced everything was fine. They may remember times when they were focused on themselves, their problems, their fears, or their own version of the story, while you were quietly trying to hold everything together. Maybe you didn't ask them to change. Maybe you didn't demand an apology. Maybe you didn't even tell them how deeply certain things affected you. You simply withdrew when you realized explaining your pain wasn't going to make it disappear. Now they are beginning to understand that your silence wasn't meant to punish them. It was the last form of communication you had left when words stopped feeling safe. That is why the regret is becoming so intense. They are not only regretting what they did, they are regretting what they failed to notice. They are thinking about the questions they never asked, the conversations they avoided, the moments they could have reached for you but didn't. And perhaps the most painful question in their mind is, what if I had known? What if they had understood your silence differently? What if they had stayed a little longer? What if they had looked beyond your words and noticed the emotion underneath them? What if they had realized that your withdrawal wasn't the end of your feelings, but the beginning of your exhaustion? Those questions have no easy answers, and that is why they keep returning. Regret doesn't always arrive like a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes it arrives quietly, late at night, when a person remembers something they thought they had forgotten. Sometimes it appears when a song brings back your voice. Sometimes it arrives when they see something that reminds them of you. Sometimes it appears when they reread an old message and suddenly notice a sentence they completely overlooked before. And now, because someone finally revealed what you were hiding, those ordinary memories have become evidence of something much deeper. They are realizing that you weren't asking for perfection. You were asking to be understood. You weren't asking them to read your mind. You were hoping they would care enough to notice when something inside you changed. And when they didn't, you stopped explaining. This is where your soulmate's regret becomes personal, because they may finally recognize that you gave them chances they didn't realize were chances. You gave them opportunities to ask, to listen, to come closer, to understand. You didn't slam every door immediately. You simply stopped standing in the doorway, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. And now they are looking at that distance differently. They may be wondering whether they still have a way back to you, whether the person who once waited for understanding is still there, or whether too much time has passed. But here's what they are slowly learning. Understanding you now doesn't automatically undo what happened before. Knowing the truth doesn't erase the nights you spent carrying everything alone. An apology might acknowledge the wound, but it cannot rewrite the moment when the wound was created. And that is why this revelation has shaken them so deeply. They are finally seeing the difference between losing someone and realizing why you lost them. They are beginning to understand that your silence wasn't the absence of love. It was the final evidence that you had loved, hoped, waited, and endured more than they ever knew. And just when they thought that was the deepest truth they could discover, another realization is beginning to surface. Your silence wasn't only about what you felt for them. It was also about what you were willing to sacrifice to keep the connection from falling apart. And that is the part they are going to have the hardest time forgiving themselves for. And now, your soulmate is beginning to understand the part of your story that hurts the most. Because the truth they finally discovered is not simply that you loved them. It is that you loved them in ways they never had the maturity, awareness, or emotional distance to recognize at the time. You were not always silent because you had nothing to say. Sometimes you were silent because there was too much to say, and you knew that once those words came out, everything would become real. You knew you could tell them how deeply they affected you, how many nights you thought about them, how many times you wanted to reach out. But you also knew that vulnerability without understanding can become another wound, so you held it inside. And now they are finally seeing the difference between someone who doesn't care and someone who cares so deeply that they would rather suffer quietly than turn their feelings into pressure. That realization is changing everything. They may be thinking, I thought they were pulling away because they didn't want me anymore. But now another voice inside them is answering, Maybe they were pulling away because they wanted me too much and were afraid of being hurt again. Imagine an ocean that looks completely still from the surface, while underneath it, entire currents are moving in different directions. That's what you were like. Calm on the outside, overwhelmed underneath. They saw the surface and assumed there was nothing deeper. Now someone has shown them what was happening beneath it, and they cannot unsee it. They are realizing that some of the things you did were actually forms of love they never recognized. Maybe you gave them space when you desperately wanted closeness. Maybe you stayed quiet during arguments because you didn't want to say something cruel. Maybe you accepted their decision, even though every part of you wanted to fight for another chance. Maybe you walked away, not because you stopped loving them, but because you realized that constantly chasing someone who was uncertain about you would slowly destroy the person you were becoming. And that is where their regret becomes complicated, because they are not just remembering what you gave them. They are realizing what you gave up. You may have sacrificed your pride, your peace, your expectations, your desire to be understood, and even the possibility of telling them the full truth. You carried those sacrifices without demanding recognition. You didn't keep a list. You didn't announce what you had done. You simply absorbed the pain and kept moving. Now they are discovering that the person they thought had an easy time walking away may have been fighting an internal battle they never saw. Someone may have told them they didn't leave because they didn't love you. They left because they couldn't keep losing themselves trying to make you understand, and that sentence can stay in someone's mind for a very long time. Because suddenly your silence doesn't look cold anymore. It looks exhausted. It looks protective. It looks like someone finally choosing peace after realizing that explaining their heart over and over wasn't changing the outcome. You might be wondering, do they finally understand me now? Maybe not every detail, but they understand enough to know they were missing something important. They understand that your silence had meaning. They understand that your distance wasn't random. They understand that the version of you they remember was carrying emotions you never fully revealed. And perhaps most importantly, they now understand that you were never asking them to save you. You simply wanted them to notice you before you reached the point where you had to save yourself. That difference is enormous, because love isn't always about dramatic confessions or endless messages. Sometimes love looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like letting someone go, even when every emotion inside you says stay. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to force a conversation because you know the other person isn't ready to hear the truth. And now your soulmate is finally looking back at those moments with a different heart. The things that once frustrated them may now make them emotional. The silence they once wanted you to break may now be the very thing they wish they had understood sooner. They may even realize that you were giving them one final opportunity to notice what was happening without forcing you to explain it. But they didn't see it. They were looking for words while you were communicating through behavior. They were waiting for a confession while you were quietly showing them the truth. And now the painful irony is that they finally understand what you were trying to say, but they learned it from someone else. That's why the regret feels so deep. They are not only missing you, they are mourning the version of the connection that might have existed if they had understood you sooner. They are looking at the past and realizing there were moments when everything could have gone differently. One conversation could have changed things. One question could have opened the door. One genuine act of understanding could have made you feel safe enough to stop hiding. But those moments passed. And now the truth has arrived after the silence has already done its work. Your soulmate may still wonder whether you will ever explain everything yourself, but something has already changed permanently. They no longer get to tell themselves that you simply stopped caring. They have heard the truth behind your silence, and now every memory carries a different weight. The person they thought they lost because of distance may actually be the person they lost because they didn't understand what that distance was trying to say. And as that realization settles deeper into them, one question is becoming impossible for them to avoid. If they had known what you were sacrificing, would they have treated your silence differently? And that question is exactly where their deepest regret begins. And now the truth has reached the point where your soulmate can no longer hide behind the version of the story they once believed. They may still remember the moments differently. They may still have questions. And they may still wonder what could have happened if they had understood you sooner. But something inside them has permanently shifted. They finally know that your silence was never empty. It carried disappointment, love, fear, restraint, and 1,000 words you chose not to release because you were trying to protect something that mattered to you. And now the person who once wondered why you became quiet is beginning to understand that your silence was actually the loudest part of your story. They are replaying everything. The conversations, the pauses, the moments you looked away, the messages you didn't send, the times you seemed fine when you were clearly carrying something deeper. Suddenly those memories feel different. Imagine receiving a map only after you've already traveled the road. Every turn suddenly makes sense, every wrong direction becomes obvious, and every place you passed without stopping starts to feel like a missed opportunity. That is where your soulmate is emotionally right now. They finally have the map, but they cannot go back and walk the same road again. This is why their regret feels heavier than simple loneliness. They aren't just thinking, I miss them. They are thinking, I didn't understand them when I had the chance. And that thought can stay with someone for a very long time. They may even be asking themselves questions they never wanted to face. Why did I assume their silence meant they didn't care? Why didn't I ask what was really happening? Why did I allow my pride, fear, or confusion to speak louder than my feelings? Why did I wait for them to explain something they were clearly struggling to say? These questions are difficult because there is no perfect answer that can erase the past. The truth is, you may never know exactly what they are thinking or whether they will eventually reach out, apologize, or try to reopen the connection. But you don't need to predict their next move to understand what has already changed. They know more now. They see you differently now. And the story they told themselves about why you disappeared can no longer survive in the same form. Someone finally gave them the missing piece, and that piece changed the entire picture. They may now realize that you weren't trying to punish them when you became distant. You weren't playing games. You weren't trying to make them chase you. You were reaching a point where continuing to explain your heart felt more painful than protecting it. And perhaps that is the truth they will remember most. You didn't stop caring. You stopped abandoning yourself. There is a difference. You can love someone and still choose distance. You can miss someone and still refuse to chase them. You can wish things had been different and still understand that you cannot keep living inside the same cycle. That is the part your soulmate may finally be learning from your silence. Love doesn't always end because feelings disappear. Sometimes it changes because one person realizes that love without understanding becomes exhaustion. They may regret the things they said, the things they didn't say, the chances they overlooked, and the moments when they assumed you would always be there. They may even wish they could return to one particular conversation and respond differently. But time doesn't work that way. The past doesn't reopen simply because someone finally understands it. And that is why your silence has become so powerful. You don't have to explain every hidden feeling anymore. You don't have to chase them with evidence. You don't have to convince them that you cared. Someone else has already told them what you couldn't say, and now they have to sit with that truth themselves. Maybe they will reach out. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will try to find a way back into your life, or maybe they will carry this realization privately for years. But either way, something important has already happened. They finally understand that the person they thought was distant was actually deeply affected, that the person they thought had moved on was once fighting to stay, and that the person they thought didn't care may have cared enough to remain silent rather than create more damage. And if they are feeling regret now, let them feel it, not because you want them to suffer, but because some lessons only become clear when there is no longer a way to avoid them. Your silence taught them something your words never could. It taught them that your heart had limits. It taught them that patience is not endless. It taught them that someone can love deeply and still walk away when staying begins to cost too much. So don't rush to break the silence simply because they finally understand it. Let the truth stand on its own. Let them process what they were finally told. Let them remember what they once overlooked. Because you don't need to return to the version of yourself that kept explaining, waiting, hoping, and silently hurting just to make someone understand your worth. Your part of the story was never about forcing them to regret losing you. It was about surviving the moment when you realized you could no longer keep hiding your pain just to preserve the connection. And now they finally know what was behind your silence. They finally understand that you weren't silent because there was nothing left to feel. You were silent because there was too much left to feel, and you had finally learned that your heart deserved protection too. Maybe that is the closure you were waiting for without realizing it. Not necessarily a message from them, not necessarily an apology, not even a return, just the knowledge that the truth you carried alone has finally reached the person who needed to hear it. They may regret what they didn't see. They may wish they had listened sooner. They may wonder whether they can ever undo the distance between you. But you don't have to carry that question anymore. Your silence has already spoken. And this time they finally heard it.